Good evening, everyone. My name is Adam Friedman. I'm the campaigns director at Interfaith Alliance, a 32-year-old civil rights organization dedicated to both countering the rise of Christian nationalism and supporting pluralistic, multiracial democracy. Before starting our call this evening, I want to say thank you to the over 2,200 folks who registered from this call. If you're calling in, from wherever you're calling in, please feel free to put that down in the chat. I see Charity already saying hi from Columbus, Ohio. I see Rachel from Concord, Massachusetts. I know we have folks coming from all 50 states and DC, so thank you all for being here. I also want to name for folks who are wondering that tonight's call will be recorded. So if you have friends who missed this really meaningful opportunity to lean into our collective muscle as people of faith and diverse beliefs and learn about next steps, tangible steps we can take to practice civil resistance, I want to assure you that soon after this webinar, you will find this recording on our YouTube channel. You'll find it via email. You'll find it far and wide, so you can send it to friends, family, to your community. I also think we have to start out by acknowledging the context that we're having this call in. We know that last week, Renee Nicole Good, a mother, a wife, an amazing person who was living in Minneapolis, was killed by an ICE agent. She was unarmed and she was simply trying to escape a bad situation. And I'm sure many of you have seen the video, have heard the stories of how ICE prevented a doctor from coming to provide medical care. And tonight I want to lift up the reflections her mother offered, calling her the kindest person she had ever met, someone who just wanted to help others. And I hope that all of us tonight, with that same spirit, can show up leading with kindness, with empathy, and a desire to help by doing what we can. So with that, I want to thank the co-sponsors and folks, amazing folks, organizations behind the planning of this call. I know I mentioned I'm here from Interfaith Alliance. We also want to thank Sojourners, the Horizons Project, the Georgetown Center on Faith and Justice, Faith in Action, and Political Research Associates for working as partners in developing this call, as well as our broader series of trainings. We know that this is a 201 call, and we know many of you had joined us for our 101 call just a few weeks ago. I also want to thank the numerous organizations from across the United States who co-sponsored this call, who sent emails, texts, all sorts of messages via social media to their network to make sure that everyone could be here tonight. So thank you. Now, before I turn it over to the amazing Reverend Adam Taylor to share some opening words and spiritual grounding with us, I just want to mention an important framing piece to hold as we shift from the 101 training, talking about the key theories and understandings that we're entering this moment with and leaning into as we practice civil resistance, to this training, the 201 context, which is focused on going deeper, exploring how clergy, lay leaders, faith communities are doing this organizing, this very real frontline civil resistance work in real time. And we're going to hear from some amazing folks leading that work on the ground in just a moment. And we're also going to talk through how you and your home community can begin or continue doing that ongoing work to build resilient local interfaith cohorts designed to resist the moment we're in, leading with nonviolence and the discipline we know is necessary to take us through this moment. So just some quick housekeeping. I know I mentioned we are recording this call. I know there are also an amazing number of folks. We're almost up to 800 on the call. And so while the chat is open, we ask that folks please try to keep the cross chatter to a minimum so everyone can see the links we're going to be adding into the chat. We also have a Q&A feature. We'll have some time for Q&A later in the call. And so if any questions arise over the course of this evening, please feel free to add your questions there. And if you have questions for any specific presenter, know that if you address the question to them using that Q&A function, they'll be able to see it and respond during the Q&A. So again, I want to say thank you from all of the organizations planning this call for being on tonight, for leaning in and choosing courage and bravery in this moment when we know we're scared, but we know that bravery and doing what we can to resist is more important. So with that, I'll pass it over to the incredible Reverend Adam Taylor for an opening prayer.
Thanks, Adam. I'll be on camera in just a second. As you know, activists and faith leaders were always on the move, so I am literally just getting home. But I am so grateful for all of the organizations that helped to co-sponsor to make this 201 training possible. And in many ways, the timing couldn't be more urgent. In light of the surge of ICE in not just Minneapolis most recently, but in LA and Chicago and my own city of DC, in Charlotte, and most likely in cities and localities to come all across this country. This is a time when our faith is being tested and stretched. And I want to remind you and encourage you that, at least from my Christian tradition and really the Judeo-Christian tradition, the most common theme in the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, is fear. God is constantly reminding us and encouraging us to not be afraid. In my own Christian faith context, we're reminded that perfect love casts out fear, that God did not give us a spirit of fear, but instead one of love and of hope and of sound mind. And so I want to encourage us to lean into this moment where we know it's going to require risk and courage and sacrifice. And that call might look different to each and every one of us as we try to lean into the unique gifts that God has given to each and every one of us. But I do believe that God has given us the smooth stones to conquer this seemingly insurmountable Goliath of consolidating and rising authoritarianism. I believe our faith could be the game changer in helping to tip the balance back toward a more resilient democracy, a multiracial, inclusive democracy that we know is aligned with our deepest faith values. And so this training is designed to equip, to inspire, to encourage, to connect. And that is all of the sacred work that is integral to our faith tradition. So I will close just with a quick word of prayer. Gracious God, we come before you with heavy hearts. Our hearts are broken by the treatment, the mistreatment of so many of our neighbors, so many of our friends and loved ones that are in our communities, that are in our congregations, that are in our city and are in our nation. God, we pray that you would meet us at our point of need, where we are feeling discouraged, where we may be feeling weak, where we may be feeling isolated. We pray that you would give us a sense of solidarity, of connection with one another, that you would give us a sense of your limitless strength. And we pray that you would give us your wisdom and your courage. Lord, help us to be your instruments of justice and of righteousness and of steadfast love, particularly toward our immigrant neighbors that are living in such a state of fear and trepidation. God, we surrender this time to you, and we pray that by the time we are done tonight, we would be empowered to be even more courageous, more faithful to what you have called us to do. It's in your precious and holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Reverend Taylor, for being here, for those powerful words, and for all that you and Sojourners are doing to lead us through this moment. I just want to take a few minutes now to speak to what you might have missed during the 201 session. We were so grateful to be joined by some fantastic trainers including Maria Stefan of the Horizons Project, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, but helped produce this slide deck. And so I just want to run through a few of the big concepts we discussed last time, knowing that we're going to get really nitty-gritty into how these approaches, these tactics are showing up on the ground over the course of the next 80 minutes. I'll also mention for folks who did miss that first webinar, the full recording is on the Georgetown Center for Faith and Justice's website and YouTube channel, and you can find that. It'll be in the chat. So I just want to start off by acknowledging the reality of where we are, right? We are in a moment of authoritarian breakthrough, right? In the 101 session, we defined what authoritarianism is, and on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how authoritarianism manifests. And it's important to acknowledge right now that we are seeing the rapid consolidation of power, the elimination of checks and balances, and operation with impunity, as we know all too well. And so, just to give this a little bit more color, offer the specific manifestations of what you might have seen over this past year, and label them, as we know we need to, as tactics directly from the authoritarian playbook. Just want to acknowledge that direct investigations against critics, which we know we're seeing a number of, and continue to. Just this day, we saw news about these new attacks on the Senator Mark Kelly, deployment of military domestically, which is a big part of why we're here, the deployment of federal agency operatives into our cities, giving license to lawbreaking, right? Pardoning of January 6thers, encouraging agents of the federal government to operate with impunity, federal law enforcement overreach similarly falling into that bucket. We also see regulatory retaliation, something that we've seen recently with the administration favoring certain company mergers over others, punishing different news outlets for how they might cover the administration. And finally, the autocrat won't leave. I know that just this past week we observed the anniversary of January 6th. And we know, especially for those of us like me who are calling in from the district from Washington, D.C. tonight, that this one is something we feel very personally. Also, in speaking about authoritarianism in the United States, we have to acknowledge what Christian nationalism is, right? So many of us in this interfaith movement come as Christians. As a Jewish person, I'm grateful for my Christian colleagues who are not only leading with their values, but also directly opposing and setting the record straight about what Christianity is and that Christian nationalism is not part of Christianity. Right? We know that Christian nationalism is this movement which conflates American identity with this exclusivist, nativist, you can see all the isms at the bottom of this slide, form of religious identity. That's really designed to favor a very narrow minority of people over all others and embed that preference into the laws of our country. It's also rooted in a few crucial myths that you see represented not only in the rhetoric of those that support the Christian nationalist movement in the United States, but now as we see an increasingly authoritarian government give license to more and more extreme behavior. We also see agencies like DHS and groups like ICE sharing on social media posts that invoke God or Jesus, or most recently, we even saw a post invoking Santa Claus and Christmas, showing that religion somehow is in support of their actions and that they have some sort of divine favor in carrying out this agenda. Lastly, I'll just mention that Christian nationalism very crucially aims to fuse religious and civil life, right? Really creating as little distance as possible in between this very narrow understanding of what religion should be and this very narrow understanding of what dominant culture should be, so that they are indistinguishable from one another. Now, this is relevant not only because we are here tonight as people organizing on the axes of faith and belief, but because we know that autocrats, authoritarians around the world invoke and rely on religious communities and religious rhetoric in order to both justify and facilitate their agenda. Right? And so, without getting into all of the text here, I just want to highlight that we see the invocation of right-wing religion, especially in authoritarian movements and regimes around the world. Right? We often see the symbolism highlighting actions over specific holidays, seeking the support of religious traditions and religious leaders around the world to support an authoritarian agenda. And we also see an appeal to traditional religious values, right? Sometimes we'll see far-right autocrats draw on these values, which often in their construction will support hierarchy, a more patriarchal family structure, disparate gender norms, and sometimes scapegoating or different postures of different minority communities under uh, a supposed traditional framework. And I want to distinguish this between, of course, the people in all of our lives who are religious and dedicated to their faith and are actively practicing, and folks who might invoke the language of religion, the trappings of religion, the ideas like traditional family values, right? Name those concepts that folks associate with religion because religion is so often beyond reproach and so central in our lives to justify the authoritarian agenda. So that's kind of a brief overview of authoritarianism, Christian nationalism. Again, there's a lot more on it that I encourage you to check out in our 101 offering. I also just want to highlight the necessity of a civil resistance movement, which is really what we're here to talk about tonight. Thanks to some really excellent research, which you can see at the bottom here, in analyzing 35 cases of democratic backsliding over the past roughly 30 years, we see a stark difference between uh, attempts to address this backsliding that incorporated centrally a civil resistance movement versus those that didn't, right? We see an over 44% difference. In fact, we know that the odds are in our favor because we are engaging in civil resistance and we are part of a movement. We are not doing this alone. And so briefly, I'll just define civil resistance here, right? At the most basic level, it's ordinary folks like us doing something extraordinary because we are working collectively. We are nonviolent. We are leading in the pursuit of justice. We are deeply principled, and we are leaning on tactics we know have been tried and true throughout history, looking back to not only the civil rights movement, which relied so heavily on demonstrations, strikes, and boycotts, but even before that, to the long history of nonviolent resistance in this country. I'm thinking about the suffragist movement, the movement for abolition, right? So many movements that relied on tactics that go beyond showing up in the street, though many of them necessarily centered demonstration, and had to be creative about taking risk and resisting in a way that met the moment. I just briefly want to mention as well pillar theory, which is kind of the operating theory that we're centering here in order to withdraw support from the authoritarian regime itself, right? And so, pillar theory at its core is the idea that the authoritarian, the government or regime, is actually not this huge, powerful entity that is unilaterally kind of dictating what we're seeing across the country. It is actually a very small group of people that are deeply bought into this ideology who rely on the support of the civil service, police and military, unions, businesses, even religion. And there are other groups we didn't mention, but can be included in this, like the legal profession. We know that folks in media, are also part of this. The regime relies on all of these different pillars of society to facilitate its agenda, or at least not get up and say no, not dissent, right? And so we know what this looks like, for example, in the civil service, where when the executive order to institute tariffs was handed down, yes, President Trump was the one who signed that into law, but it required folks from across the civil service actually implementing that law, or that executive order, I should say, in order for it to go into effect. Similarly, we know that the administration can invoke religion as justification for inhumane authoritarian action. can even invoke God, can invoke divine mandate to take these kinds of actions. And it is imperative upon all of us to withdraw our support or our complicity through silence from what we're seeing. I also want to name that this is not just something that we do within our pillars, but the pillar of religion is somewhat unique in that we can organize across every other pillar, right? We know that in our houses of worship, for me as a Jewish person, on any given Friday night, I know for a lot of Christians on the call, on any given Sunday, as some say, uh, folks who gather in our houses of worship cut across these pillars. And so when we talk to our religious communities about standing up, engaging in civil resistance, we are talking to business leaders, we are talking to union members, we are talking to members of law enforcement, we are talking to government employees. And in doing so, we are sharing these ideas of how we can engage in resistance and be part of a broad movement, a big tent movement, with people that are operating across the professions, which through silence can sometimes enable the authoritarian agenda. And so I know we're short on time. This is a quote from Gene Sharp, who created this theory to the effect of what I just described. I also just want to name, before I turn it over to our next amazing speaker, that as people of faith and diverse beliefs, we have superpowers when we show up and engage in civil resistance, right? The role of morality is something that cannot be overstated because we know that, and there's a lot of research to back this up, faith leaders dressed in identifiably as such in religious garb on the front lines of a protest, standing in front of the polls, in places where we recognize there's the threat of violence, are actually an incredibly effective kind of not only group of folks, but a symbol to dissuade folks from engaging in political violence. We also know that houses of worship and faith communities broadly have been focal points for organizing and training throughout American history. We know that communities of faith are great at providing resources, the language of mutual aid, which can also look like meal trains and these other kinds of modes of supporting one another that we might take for granted as kind of a mutual aid approach to organizing. We also know that invoking our religious traditions, the symbols, the spiritual power that undergird and strengthen our movements and us as individuals, we can offer and lift up to strengthen our collective action, right? To strengthen demonstrations, to strengthen movements and campaigns over time. We also know that faith, as I mentioned on the last slide, uh, unites folks from across different walks of life, is an inherent bridge building mechanism. And finally, there's a long history of non-cooperation from the faith pillar in American society. And just to briefly define that, non-cooperation is the act of refusing to cooperate or complying with requests, demands, or orders, right? The goal of non-cooperation as a framework is to push for defections within a pillar, to get folks to gum up the works, to stop saying, okay, I'm going to carry out this authoritarian agenda in order to essentially cause the authoritarian system to defect and get a U-turn back not to what was before, but to a healthier, stronger democracy. And finally, because this is a big theme that we'll be talking about tonight, there are levels to this non-cooperation work, right? We might begin with what we can do as a single person, right? Maybe buying local, not supporting businesses that are contracting with ICE, which can then fold into larger actions. How do we in our congregation engage in that behavior? To something more collective. How can we across a community plan a march around this? Maybe boycott a business that we know is contracting with ICE or supporting this agenda to mass non-cooperation. How can we, as millions of Americans from across this country, engage in a movement-wide effort to withdraw our cooperation from the regime? So I appreciate y'all bearing with me through that recap of our 101 training. And again, just a gentle reminder, I encourage you, if you have not done so, to please go on to YouTube, go to the Georgetown Center for Faith and Justice's page, and watch that 101 training, which has some really amazing content. I'll stop there, and I'm so grateful to pass it off to a really incredible organizer who I know leans on her faith often in this work, coming to us from Minneapolis, Minnesota. You do.
All righty. Thank you, Adam. Good evening, everybody. Um, I just want to say first and foremost, thank you so much to everybody who is joining us on the call tonight. And yes, my name is Yudu. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a proud daughter of Mexican and Vietnamese immigrants, and I am based in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul area of Minnesota. But originally, I was born and raised in northern Minnesota, in Virginia, Minnesota, if you know where that is. But before I get to everything that I want to share with you all tonight about what's happening in Minnesota and what's happening in our work, I just want to take a moment to center my parents. Um, they are immigrants from Vietnam who my mom is a devout Buddhist and my dad is a very passionate Catholic. Um, and growing up, in a multi-faith, interfaith household, I remember every night growing up and praying for world peace, praying for peace from violence, for peace from war, an end to hunger. And something that I remember even early on in those days when I was young is that I didn't quite understand why we were praying for those things, not because they weren't worthy, but because I didn't understand why they existed. And I think that's something that I still hold on to very much as a faith leader, as an interfaith organizer. Um, that these things, these injustices are created by us. They're not natural, and um, they should never be expected to be something that is normal and normalized. And, as a daughter of immigrants, I have always been passionate about immigrant rights organizing. And in the past, a little over a year, I started really organizing through immigrant rights in a very intimate way. And I started organizing with the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee in Minneapolis, in Minnesota. And I come with a very heavy heart coming to this call tonight, but I knew it was much needed to talk about what's happening in Minnesota. And, and Wednesday, when we learned of the news that we had organizers from our organization on the ground minutes, moments after Renee was killed. And I remember speaking with someone on the phone, updating them, and they're like, how do you know this information? Like, it hasn't hit the news yet. And I go, because I have folks on the ground who are there, it hasn't hit the news yet. And then I realized it hasn't hit the news yet. I need to inform the news. So I started calling local and national news outlets. Some of them knew, some of them didn't, to cover this. And, it escalated in a way that was just really unexpected and very appreciative of the escalation. And, when we talk about interfaith organizing, when we talk about the response right now, um, it's incredibly moving to see the same day that Renee was killed, the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee hosted a vigil that night at, I believe it was 5 p.m., but it was hours um, after she was killed, and folks, 10,000 people showed up to the vigil. And this past Saturday, I was one of the lead speakers for our protest in March demanding ICE out of Minnesota. And we always knew it was going to be a big action, but we expected 20, 30,000, over 100,000 people showed up to the march and the protest on Saturday. So when we talk about what's happening in Minnesota, what's happening across the country in regards to immigration, this is truly a watershed moment for our movement and for our work. And um, I think that a lot of things have been said about immigrants this past year from the Trump administration, from right wing conservatives calling us fraudsters, calling us terrorists, but that's not what I see. And that's not what we see. What I see is that despite the level of violence that we've seen perpetuated against our community, especially after Renee was killed, folks are still showing up at all hours of the day, no matter what their faith, with a whistle, with know your rights information, and most importantly, with their voice, ready to advocate for those who, and advocate on folks' behalf who cannot be there. I'm seeing folks unprecedentedly engaging in mutual aid in the form of groceries, in the form of rent, in the form of direct cash, in the form of security, making sure that businesses are safe, making sure that folks, workers are getting to and from their work safely and can get home, and that folks are housed and fed. That's what I see. And when we see protesters and we see faith leaders and we see folks on the front lines being brutalized by ICE agents through chemical deterrents, we see people who are coming to their aid immediately to provide medical aid. And we don't need to know people's face. We don't need to know people's names to know that this is injustice and this is wrong. And we're here to defend each other and defend our movement. And I think, things are changing really rapidly in this movement. And something that I spoke to a New York Times reporter about today is that we were discussing past movements, from the civil rights movement to the movement for Palestinian liberation to the movement in response to the murder of George Floyd, that hits home in a way that's so acutely here. And we were talking about, the question was, if we draw inspiration from those movements, and do we feel like we're making history right now in the movement that we're in? And I draw inspiration. I draw inspiration from civil rights leaders, from Malcolm X, from Fred Hampton, from other leaders within progressive movements. And I also do believe, it's hard to conceptualize right now, but we are making history in how we are responding to what's happening. And it's hard to conceptualize it because you're making history right now. But I think that there's a lot about past movements that we can learn from. But there's also an escalation of AI, of tech, of mass surveillance, that we simply do not have the history. Our ancestors have not had to navigate these things in the movement. So we're really figuring out in real time what that playbook is. And the last couple things I want to say, because I want to be mindful of time, and I am happy to answer more questions too, is that we're seeing elected officials step up in a way, and hope to continue to step up in this work of folks pressuring and calling for the governor and state leadership to call for an eviction moratorium, and for the city of Minneapolis City Council to call for an eviction moratorium, because we should not be punishing immigrants for the occupation that is here and that is growing, and other forms of action as well, from legal action from the state that was announced today to folks every day just trying to support local and support their businesses who are suffering from all of this. And the last thing I'll say too is that, in my remarks on Saturday, since the moment that I learned of Renee's name, she hasn't left my mind. Her name hasn't left my mind, because her name is such a simple and powerful reminder that she was good, and that her intentions were good, and that her heart is good, and that despite all the things that they're throwing at us in our way, from Minneapolis to LA to Chicago to our rural cities to our most urban places in our country, is that despite all the tools that they're throwing at us, people are still showing up, because they believe that goodness and justice can still prevail. And that is the message that I want to leave you all with, is that when we think of Renee, I think of goodness. I think of her heart. I think of her soul. I think of her intentions. And I know that we will get through this as a movement and as a people, even if in these dark moments. But we know that faith leaders and faith movements have always prevailed in times of injustice and oppression. And with that, I want to be mindful of time. So I want to pass it next to Reverend Susie Hayward, who will continue to speak on and our movement and our work as well. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you so much, Dudo. It's good to be in the movement with you. And it's good to be with all of you. So I am coming at you from Minneapolis on stolen Dakota land. My name is Reverend Susie Hayward. I am with Creekside UCC in the south side of Minneapolis. And I want to just underscore a lot of what Diodo was saying about the incredible ways that our community is showing up in this time. And for me as a Christian, what I am so inspired by too is seeing the ways in which we are grounding ourselves. We are demonstrating the greatest command of all from God, or to love, and to love neighbor. And we are seeing that in all the ways that our community is responding. And there has been roles for everybody. So from the folks who are out on the streets, making sure that nothing happens in the dark, following ICE like Renee was, and defending their neighbors, to the folks who are doing some of the more underground stuff with the mutual aid, with providing safe sanctuary for folks, and just just incredible acts, whether they are Christian or Muslim or don't identify with any religious tradition. I just see manifest this incredible embodiment of the greatest command. And frankly, I see an incredible awakening of democracy that is happening here right now, with neighbors getting connected to one another, with relationships and networks mobilizing at a very grassroots level that is creating this kind of people power here. So that's some of the good news. But I do want to speak with clarity about what is happening here in Minneapolis. Um, the federal government has declared war on Minnesota, and we are facing an occupation by ICE right now that is terrorizing our community. We're seeing indiscriminate arrests of people who, based on racial profiling, so people are being stopped, people are being detained, no matter if they have citizenship status of some point, and in some cases just being disappeared. We are seeing people being terrorized, folks going to the ICE going door to door, going into businesses. There's a lack of respect for laws. So they're going into spaces even without warrants. They are, for the folks who are out there doing the observing every day, they are facing intimidation and harassment. They're being followed to their homes, and the ICE agents are taking photos of them. I mean, it is, there is a lot of fear and chaos that is being sowed right now by the federal government in Minneapolis, which um, and also forms of, the plate switching and things like this. I mean, just many kinds of illegal activities that are happening, which also in the face of this gives me a great deal of pride in my community for the ways in which they are responding in love and nonviolently and in a deeply intersectional way. And I want to note that a lot of the fast mobilization that has been able to happen in Minneapolis in response to this, to care for one another, comes out of the relationships and the infrastructure that was built in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing. So there's been an ability to draw on those relationships of trust that were built between organizers from different movements, between faith communities and those who don't necessarily identify with faith or religion, and the mutual aid efforts that were being done at the time. So we've been able to mobilize that. And frankly, I think the power of organizing in Minnesota, which we have a long tradition of populist organizing in this state. We're home to the American Indian movement, among other incredible organizing historical legacies. I think that's part of the reason that we are being targeted. Also because of the uprising and the power of that uprising that happened after the murder of George Floyd, that had sort of an impact nationally as well as internationally. And so I think that's part of the reason that we're being targeted, is because of the extraordinary people power here. With respect to, I had the great honor of working with Maria Stefan at USIP, and we did a lot of work together overseas, looking at the role of religion and faith actors in various forms of nonviolent action. And so I love seeing the way that we're now applying some of these lessons from the folks we learned from overseas. We have so much to learn from the folks who have done incredible work of protecting democracy. We sometimes in the US have a posture of American exceptionalism, that we know well how to do democracy, but in reality, like, we haven't faced a threat like this, many of us, in our lifetimes. And so what do we have to learn from the folks in Myanmar? What do we have to learn from the folks in South Korea or Brazil or other places? And I'm grateful for all that I learned from Maria Stefan and from the Freedom Trainers, and some of the work that they've done to talk about that authoritarian capture in the pillars, so that we can think strategically. So with respect to what's happening here, we're seeing a lot of different forms within that framework. With respect to what we're seeing here, there's a lot of different forms of non-cooperation that are happening. We're seeing postal workers who are marching. These are federal workers who are marching in opposition to their parking lots being used by ICE to stage. Um, we're seeing some right now, just episodic, but examples, like many of you might have seen the Hilton Hotel that was refusing to house ICE. We're seeing restaurants doing similar things. Our our Minneapolis park system passed a separation ordinance. We are a sanctuary city, so there's the city policy writ large is non-cooperation with immigration, federal immigration. But there was sort of an exception for the Minneapolis parks, which operates more autonomously. But our city council mobilized quite quickly and were able to pass a separation ordinance to ensure that ICE could not be using city parks as well for their staging. Um, and we're seeing a number of examples of ways in which folks are engaging with ICE agents in ways that are also in helping to elicit shifts of loyalty or encouraging shifts of loyalty is one of the guiding principles of the Freedom Trainers. So I can give an example there. I was with some of my clergy colleagues at the ICE headquarters building, which is called Whipple here on Thursday, the morning after Renee was murdered. And we were engaging with ICE agents there and sort of calling them in to thinking about how their faith and their deep moral convictions aligns with what had happened the day before to Renee and what the community was experiencing there. And we're actually engaging in conversations with some of these folks. So one of the ICE agents told me that he was going to go home and read Matthew 25 that night. So we're seeing some of those invitations to disobey, to elicit shifts of loyalty that are also necessary as part of this larger what's necessary in order to protect democracy and to stop an authoritarian breakthrough. And then with the faith response that's happening, I want to highlight in kind of two different buckets what I'm seeing. So there's both the pastoral and there's the prophetic actions that are taking place. So with respect to the pastoral, we have incredible religious diversity. And you have that in the biography of two, but you have that in because we are home to so many different immigrant refugee populations over decades. We have a lot of Muslim, Buddhist, indigenous, many different traditions that are represented here. And we're seeing both within these communities and then across these communities ways in which they were responding pastorally in order to offer vigils, in order to engage in mutual aid, to support vulnerable neighbors, ways in which they are serving as a chaplain presence. We have a movement chaplain network here that is showing up in some of the spaces of protest. Ways in which we are showing up as Adam was speaking to, in our clergy garb in order to be that sort of, my colleague calls it ethical spectacle presence on the streets, standing with our community and inviting in the moral authority and the challenge to the Christian nationalist narrative of the government, and in standing with our communities and with the greatest command of love God and love neighbor. In so doing, with some of my other clergy colleagues, we have been organizing a nightly healing space, just trying to hold all of those who are operating at the front lines of caring for our communities, who are experiencing intimidation, harassment, trauma. Their cortisol is rushing all day long. And so helping them at the end of the day, creating a space for them to take care of their bodies and to take care of their spirits and to do the kind of soul work that is necessary for folks to be able to sustain themselves in the long work. With respect to the prophetic bucket of work that religious communities are engaged in here, we are organizing within our own communities. So a lot of us, I can speak for my own church community. We've been for months now helping to prepare our communities for this, seeing that this was coming. There has been various forms of legal awareness training, legal observer trainings that have been happening. We've been supporting those, organizing them, hosting them, within our various houses of worship that have served as sort of these spaces that can literally hold the huge demand that there is from my neighbors to be able to get this kind of training that can allow them to be able to do the kind of work like Renee and her wife Becca were doing on Wednesday of observing and videotaping and ensuring that nothing happens in the dark. We have been, engaged in press conferences. We have been planning various forms of public actions in deep conversation with other organizers and with lawyers. Um, we've we've been thinking about how those within our various faith communities connect to the different pillars. So we recognize that, like within our own faith communities, our houses of worship, we have folks that intersect with the business pillar or the labor pillar or the media pillar or the local government pillar. So how can we also use our places of worship as spaces for some of that strategic thinking for the movement writ large about how to engage across these different spaces? We have been showing up in order, on Wednesday, I was there with some of my colleagues right after Renee was murdered in order to be a prayerful presence and in order to stand with our community at that time to pray on the space, on the place where Renee was murdered. Um, and I want to give a particular shout out to the Indigenous community here because we have, in addition to our Muslim community has been doing prayer literally on the streets sometimes as part of our protests. Some of my Christian and UU and other colleagues from those traditions have been offering prayers and so on. But our Indigenous community is so central to this organizing as well in their forms of ceremony and drumming and dance and prayer. The organizing is drenched as well in the offerings that we get from our Anishinaabe and our Dakota and other Indigenous communities that exist here, which is such a vibrant and central dimension of the local community here in Minneapolis. And of course, folks who have this is not new for them, this kind of experience from the federal government. So they also bring the deep wisdom of their tradition and from their experience of how to respond rooted in those cultural and spiritual practices and for the power that they offer, both prophetic and pastorally, to be able to respond to this moment. Um, I also just want to note some things that I think are particularly distinctive about Minneapolis at this time. And I say this as someone who grew up here and then lived on the East Coast, worked in places overseas, and came back here just a couple of years ago and have integrated into it. And one of the things that really strikes me is that in some places, you don't necessarily have integration between, quote unquote, secular organizers and organizations or non-faith aligned um, organizations and efforts and the faith community. And that is not the case in Minneapolis. There is just a deep level of respect and entanglement and engagement between the various organizing spaces and the organizations that lead work within different sort of issue areas and faith communities here. And that has been, I think, because my clergy colleagues, for a decade or more have been showing up in very much a fellowship mode with organizers here. So showing up in order to support, not trying to co-opt or take the lead as religious leaders, but to follow the lead of organizers within immigrant justice and climate justice and other realms, and to be willing to pivot if what we're thinking might be helpful might not be helpful. So that level of humility and relationship building, and again, really deepened and strengthened during the time of the uprising. I am seeing as well the power of that legacy now in the kind of integration and trust that there is for religious actors. And that's, including in a place where we have a lot of, this is a queer refuge state. Renee was herself a queer woman. We have a lot of folks who come here seeking safe refuge from some of the Christian nationalist policies that have been harmful to particularly trans communities, but other queer communities. And so people who have experienced religious trauma, oftentimes in their own religious communities of birth. And so even with the recognition that there are folks here who have experienced that kind of religious trauma, it is remarkable to me that there is that deep level of trust, that an integration that happens between those communities. Um, and I also just want to say, in a lot of the work that we're doing, I talk about the pastoral and the prophetic as two different buckets, but the reality is that a lot of the pastoral is at the same time prophetic, and the prophetic is at the same time pastoral. And I think what's also been really important for me and my clergy colleagues in this time is not just the followership model with our organizers who have the deep wisdom and connections with local communities, but also ensuring that we always have that balance within the prophetic and the pastoral. There is deep grief and deep trauma that is being experienced by our communities right now. And we need to be able to respond pastorally. We need to, when we're going into this space, at 34th and Portland, where Renee was murdered, where there is now a memorial that is being set up, we need to recognize as religious leaders and be incredibly humble about how we show up in that space that holds and the grief of that space and responds in both a pastoral way and that thinks prophetically with respect to what kind of message can we offer that challenges some of the Christian nationalist and other harmful narratives, much less actions that are being taken by our federal government. So there's a lot more I could say, but I'm going to stop there and hope that we'll be able to take it up in the panel discussion. So I am now going to turn it over to Joseph Thomas McCullough from Los Angeles. Thank you, everybody.
Hi, good evening, everybody. It's a blessing to be with you all. Thank you so much, Reverend Hayward, deeply moved by the many ways in which you are channeling the energies of God. I lead Pico, California, which is a statewide faith-based community organizing network, multi-faith, multiracial. Been an organizer for 20 years in California and New York and based in Los Angeles. I'm actually speaking to you from Dallas, Texas this evening, but my home base is LA. And I was asked to share a bit about kind of what life has been like in LA on the immigration and non-cooperation front as it relates to keeping families together and responding to some of the family separations and raids that have been taking place. I just wanted to share one thing by way of maybe offering some anchoring and context. I got to be in Rome in a meeting with Pope Leo the 14th, the new Pope, the new leader of the Roman Catholic Church, at a gathering called the World Meeting of Popular Movements. And it was such a moving and inspiring encuentro, kind of an encounter with him. And he said two things that have continued to stir in my spirit. One is he was reflecting on the challenges of our times, including the challenges of family separations and raids. And he said, our job in these times is to do two things. One is to unleash a torrent of moral energy, and two is to become poets of solidarity. And I think much of what we've been trying to do in Los Angeles and across California, in many ways, can be summed up in those two notions of unleashing torrents of moral energy and trying to become poets of solidarity. And I love the notion of poetry as social change, as prophetic witness, as Reverend Hayward just spoke about, because poetry isn't linear. Poetry is art. It's messy. It's sometimes stormy. It requires us to summon courage and creativity and to take risk and to overcome sometimes the trappings of institutional maintenance, that can suffocate the prophetic mission of our work. And I just think the best poetry, maybe the best social change work comes from somewhere deep within our souls. So I just wanted to share that by way of maybe bringing Pope Leo, the first US born Pope, into our space. On June 6th last year, the raids and family separations in Los Angeles really ramped up. That was the day when ICE officers raided garment factories and detained dozens of immigrants who were sewing the clothes that we wear. And immigrants all around the city, all around the state since then have been arrested, sent to detention centers where the conditions are better suited for animals than for human beings. And you might remember back in the summer of last year seeing images on your TV screen or your phone of massive protests, a few that turned violent, the vast majority of which were very peaceful. President Trump at that time was calling the protesters violent insurrectionists and invaders and communists, and used that demonizing language as pretext for then sending in the military. And then on the other side, many of the protesters, many young people from a place of, I think, understandable pain and anger were saying, F ICE, F Donald Trump. And getting lost, I think, in the chaos were the stories about people and their families who were being separated, fathers and mothers being torn from their children, kids not knowing if they would ever see their parents again. And so the faith communities I work with organized a prayer vigil a few days after June 6th on June 9th in a park downtown, a block from the Catholic Cathedral, 3 blocks from the federal courthouse and detention center. And our main message was different from the kind of polarizing, maybe narrative that was in the news. The message was families are sacred. Families are sacred became the mantra. And close to 2,000 clergy and lay leaders and community members showed up at that vigil. The Catholic Archbishop Jose Gomez came. He offered a strong condemnation of the immorality of separating families. We processed singing This Little Light of Mine all the way to the federal building, offered prayer and testimonies from families that had been impacted by the separations. And for months, we held weekly prayer vigils in some part of the LA region. In San Diego and San Francisco, to this day, we continue to train volunteers to accompany immigrants into courthouses where many immigrants are being taken from their families in an attempt to shield them from being taken by ICE officers, or at least to bear witness to the atrocities. There are many congregations where volunteers are collecting food donations, delivering groceries to immigrants in homes where they're too afraid to go shopping because of the fear of being detained. At a recent vigil in downtown LA at a place called La Placita, there was a young 22-year-old woman named Frances who shared her testimony. A few weeks ago, Frances's father, who's a delivery person, was unloading his delivery truck at a grocery store in a city in the San Gabriel Valley called Pico Rivera, where actually my mother grew up and where I spent a lot of my childhood. And he was unloading his truck, and ICE officers with assault rifles approached and detained him. And her father, she said, pleaded with ICE officers to allow him to finish his delivery so that the store and his bosses wouldn't think he had abandoned his job. He asked to finish the job, and the ICE officers did not. They loaded him into a van and sent him to Adelanto detention camp. And at this vigil, Frances shared this testimony, and through tears, she said, I don't know if I'll ever see my father again. The last thing I said to him before he left for work that morning was, "I love you, Papa." She said, "My heart is broken, but believe it or not, my faith is strong." She said, "My faith is strengthened by our collective resistance, by strangers who tell me that I'm not alone." And she said, "I won't stop coming to these vigils. I won't stop resisting until my father and all of our mothers and fathers are back with their families." She said, "Because families are sacred." And so these vigils have been a big part of what we've been doing. The courthouse work, the mutual aid. We've also been organizing campaigns at the city level where there are things cities can do to try to disrupt the deportation machine. In fact, in a place called Vista, California, which is in North San Diego County, just south of LA, in a small conservative city of about 100,000 people, there is a church named St. Francis that in the fall turned out about 300 people for a city council meeting, delivering the swing vote on the city council of 5 people. And they were pushing for an ordinance that was passed, and that ordinance prohibits ICE officers from enforcement activities in non-public areas of city-owned or city-controlled properties without a judicial warrant. Um, it doesn't affect all properties. It won't stop all of the family separations and raids, but it was also a symbolic measure that was important for people of faith to fight for. And there's other examples of this. In the wake of Renee Good's killing in Minneapolis last week, I've had conversations with clergy who have said, we're looking for something beyond just a vigil to lament and bear witness. That continues to be important, but what can we do concretely from a policy standpoint that might keep families together and save lives and prevent more killings like the one we saw last week? And so we're talking about the ways in which local law enforcement can play a role. In a place called Evanston, Illinois, they've passed an ordinance that says that local law enforcement has to accompany ICE in their enforcement activities. Local law enforcement acting as sort of legal observers and even protectors of people. Um, there's a push right now in Minneapolis for local law enforcement to use their power to actually arrest ICE officers when they cross the line, when they violate human rights. There's pushes on members of Congress, whatever their partisan party affiliation, to push them to act, to cease ICE operations until a full investigation can be completed, until accountability measures can be advanced. And there's also pushes in California and other parts of the country to demand task forces in every city, such that records are being collected through things like truth commissions that allow for accountability measures to happen in the future. So, in summary, mutual aid, court accompaniment, detention center ministries, vigils and outdoor religious services and prayer is happening at sites of family separations. Um, there's corporate accountability campaigns that are happening. Just yesterday, there was a vigil at a Home Depot and a Target in Los Angeles, as a way of highlighting and disrupting the profit-making ventures that hurt and tear apart immigrant families. And as I said, there's these kind of local campaigns that are attempting to get people in positions of power to commit to pass policies that support and protect families. I'll just say one last thing in closing. You know, I was asked to speak about immigrants and families and the raids and separations and all the work that's been happening since last summer. I just want to mention that there are many other forms of pressure that immigrants and non-immigrants alike are experiencing. I think Reverend Tracy Blackman, my great colleague, might speak to this in a few moments. But millions and millions of people are losing access to their healthcare because their costs of their premiums are going up. I just met with a pastor who was talking about people in his congregation who've seen their premiums rise from like $800 a month to $2,000 a month overnight. People losing access to food because of SNAP benefit cuts. And I just want to say that we think that the upcoming Lenten and Easter and Pentecost season creates opportunities to bear witness in ways that allow us to live out the sacred rituals of this season. In the Catholic tradition, we're talking about stations of the cross, not just in the confines of a church building, but around a detention center or around a clinic that's at risk of closing because of healthcare costs, or around a county building where people depend on getting access to food benefits. Forms of public worship and Eucharistic processions in public as a way of bearing witness and practicing our faith in public and calling to light both the pain of this time, but also the great promise, the promise of Easter, the promise of resurrection, and the promise that our collective faith traditions give to each and every one of us. So with that, I will wrap and I will pass it over to my great friend, Reverend Adam Taylor of Sojourners.
Thank you, Joseph. That was powerful and also really practical. We want to get into a conversation with the three speakers you just heard from. I want to really thank each one of them for their pastoral and prophetic work and witness. You do, Reverend Susie, Joseph, thank you. And I want to invite into the conversation Reverend Tracy Blackman, who is also joining us for this particular panel conversation. So one of the goals of this training is to really try to get as practical as we can. And we realize there's no single handbook for all of the tactics and strategies that can be employed in the face of the cruelty, the lawlessness, and the aggressive tactics of ICE in this administration. But I would love for each of you to reflect briefly on this question. The first is, how can we stay spiritually grounded and resilient in the midst of all that's happening? And what advice would you give to many people, many faith leaders on this call, this Zoom, who may not know where to start? I mean, lots of, suggestions and ideas have been already shared, but what advice would you give to them as they're thinking about what to do if the next city on ICE's map happens to be their own? And Reverend Tracy, maybe I'll start with you if you don't mind. Welcome. Grateful to have you.
Thank you for hosting this call and also for inviting me to join. I'm reflecting on the words that I heard as I was waiting in the background and praying as I'm reflecting upon them. What I would hope that we are able to do as people of faith is not lose sight of the sacredness of all humanity, to not buy into the either or, to not villainize others for the sake of our own safety, to not lean into the fear, but to remember that we are all whole and holy. And that's becoming increasingly more important right now. Last night, we in Faith Out Loud held a conversation for the first time, inviting people who disagree with us just to meet on a Zoom call. And it's called just a Zoom call, to hear where are the places that we're different, to hear the stories that make us come to different decisions, and to use those conversations not just to highlight the differences, but the places where we intersect. One of the most powerful things that people of faith have is the power of story. And not just the story that we have now, but the story that we base our faith and our lives on. right? We've been in situations, biblically, we've been in situations historically that did not look like they could turn around. And the beauty of the text is that we see how when people began to put their faith into action, that supernatural things can occur. So I want to stop at the beginning of your question and say what I hope that we'll do is not allow anything to cause us to make us unable to see one another in this moment, to remember one another's humanity. And for people of faith, that's a high call because it doesn't mean just the people who are hurting, but it means the people also who are doing the hurting. So that we can continue to have conversations that bring us closer together and that illuminate the humanity that is in us all.
Thank you, Tracy. Reverend Susie, you want to particularly maybe reflect on the second question, if you can?
Remind me what the second question was, Adam.
It's kind of realizing there's no single handbook for folks that might be newer or preparing for what is being done in cities like Minneapolis and elsewhere.
Yeah.
What advice would you give them? There's someone that had a question that was from more of a rural area and was kind of
Yeah.
wondering how they should be preparing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one, first, I just want to second everything that Reverend Tracy said, and particularly as we think about, eliciting loyalty shifts too, that happens when you engage people as humans and engage with in conversation with them and see them and see that we are all part of this system that is harming us. And, particularly in how the clergy are seeking to, some of my clergy colleagues and I are seeking to engage with ICE agents on the street here. Like, I see the moral injury that some of them are experiencing and participating in this, and to witness to that and to name that and to invite them into, a conversation about their deepest values. Um, and we have so much from our wisdom traditions and from our ancestors who have lived through times like these about how to sustain our souls and how to stay connected to the source and to each other in this time. And then secondly, I just wanted to say a couple folks asked, is the Jewish community involved in Minneapolis? And thank you for asking that question and for naming that I didn't say that. And I deeply apologize. I hope you will offer me grace. Um, we're experiencing a lot right now. But yes, 100% at the center of so much of this. I am with my Jewish rabbinical colleagues daily, on multiple calls today, on the streets in the past few days. And Jewish community action has been a particularly important organizing entity, and of course, a lot to offer from Jewish history and Jewish tradition about how to respond pastorally and prophetically in the face of state violence. Um, on the question of how to prepare, I mean, one, I do want to underscore again, begin now, everybody, because um, in order to be able to really mobilize at the scale that is necessary for the kind of assault that like we're experiencing in Minneapolis and that may be coming in other places that I know other cities have already experienced, you need to lay the groundwork now. And there is a lot there. I mean, we in Minneapolis have benefited from what we have learned from folks in Chicago, what we have learned from folks in Portland, in LA, in DC, and other places. And I know that we want to share. We're strengthening sort of as we go the resilience of the resistance and the immunity to this kind of toxicity that is coming. So watch and learn what's happening. Reach out to the activists in those places to learn the techniques and the strategies that they've used, how to use Signal, download Signal if you haven't yet, because that has been a key tool for the organizing. Um, get the know your rights material, start printing the signs, do lay the groundwork now so that if when the time comes, you are able to in very practical ways just um, hit on and mobilize the network. And then again, to the question of sustainability and spiritual practices, I also want to encourage you to prepare in that way too. Like, deepen your centering prayer practices from the Christian tradition, deepen your Buddhist practices. Somatic practice has been an important element of the healing spaces and the spiritual care here for both our immigrant communities, with all they're experiencing, and for our rapid response network, helping people to come back into their bodies at the end of the day when they have been operating at such a elevated, activated scale. So develop those practices, begin to develop those practices now to prepare yourself spiritually, to prepare your systems to be able to respond in love and to respond um, without being firmly rooted in who you are and who your values are, and so that you can sustain yourself and so that you can stay grounded and not be sort of thrown off course by the assault that comes, because that's what they're seeking to do, is to overwhelm you and to throw you off course. So ground yourself, drench yourself in those practices now as well.
Thanks, Reverend Susie. Joseph and Yudu, I'm going to come to you in just a second. I just want to acknowledge one of the challenges with this format is there are such good questions that are in the chat, and there's just no way we're going to answer them all. So I want to send our regrets for that. But what we will do is try to answer as many as we can in the follow-up. I know many of you are asking for more details, additional resources, follow-up steps. All of that will be communicated to you after this 201 training is over. But for now, let me just turn it for kind of a closing thought, insight, word of inspiration from you, and then you, Joseph.
Yeah, thank you, Reverend. I think Reverend Susie spoke to it beautifully, so I didn't want to keep it short to make sure we have time for other questions. But I think something that I've been saying to folks, to answer really the first question around folks who are newer to this work, getting into this work, an example that I've been using, I'm laughing because it's kind of silly, but, the example I've been using for folks who are trying to get into this work or in it, or they're new to it, you know, if you think about, I think I love using analogies. And if you're thinking about liberation for our communities, particularly our immigrant communities, as getting to a destination, getting to the Grand Canyon, let's say, I think something that we as organizers, as faith leaders, as movement people, sometimes we get bogged down by the urgency. We get bogged down by the gravity of the work, the weight. And sometimes when we're trying to do good work and we're trying to, get to that destination, we get so bogged down by, there's so many things to figure out. There's so many things we got to do. What if we're not doing it the right way? And the most important thing is to just start driving. Just you have to figure out where you're going, what vehicle you're taking, and who's driving. And everything else you can figure out along the way. But I hate to see, and we've seen it with other movements, where we get so bogged down by the weight and the work and the questions that we need to answer, that all of a sudden our tank of gas that once was full is now out and we haven't even left the driveway yet. And all that momentum is gone. So when we have momentum as a movement now more than ever, but we need to propel it in the right direction. And whether it's your first day organizing or your thousandth day organizing, everyone needs to show up in the way that works for them and that works for, that's responsive to what they can give to this movement. So I would say to folks, we all make mistakes. We all had our first day of organizing. I've made my fair share of mistakes to be able to be here now. And it's so important to just start going in a direction and see where things go rather than getting bogged down by the weight of it. And the other thing, which I'll speak to very quickly, is I think something that I think in addition to everything the Reverend Susie's talked about is that, the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee actually did a huge mutual aid project at the end of the year, around December, around the holiday time, where we worked directly with communities of faith and faith leaders to give out over $40,000 of gift cards and food and tamales for folks who eat tamales for the holiday season, and grocery delivery, just to give people a moment of relief in all of this intensity. So I think that coordinating that mutual aid directly with faith leaders is something that I truly recommend with other immigrant rights organizations, is what we've seen that's been very impactful.
Yeah, thank you. Joseph, real quick.
Yeah, I'll just offer maybe a quote from someone who has been a source of wisdom and inspiration, a guy named Fred Ross Sr., who founded the Community Service Organization in the 1960s. He mentored Cesar Chavez, one of the founders of the United Farm Workers Movement. And he used to say, if there's something to do, do it now. And he would also say, if you wait until you have all the time, the people, the resources, the right strategy to act, you will inevitably miss opportunities to fill a window where the moral arc of the universe gets bent. And I just think that to the comments that have been made already, just do it. Just try something. Just bear witness. There is no perfect formula for it. But the Spirit goes before us, and our job is to be public with our faith, with our love. John Lewis, who wrote the foreword to Reverend Adams' book, said protest is an act of love, not an act of anger. And so I would just encourage everyone to just do it. And you will learn and you will grow. And the more you can be connected to organizations like Sojourners and so many others that are on this call, the more refined you'll get, the more confident you'll get, but you have to start somewhere. And the prayer is that we all learn to bear witness during this time of so much peril, but also so much promise.
Thank you, Joseph. So well said. If you could join me in thanking Reverend Susie, Udo, and Joseph and Reverend Tracy. You've given us so much hope and encouragement. I just want to close this panel by actually underscoring something Joseph mentioned. I'm a Baptist preacher, so I don't often quote the Pope, but maybe I should do that more often. But I love what he said to you, that we need a torrent of moral energy, and we need, I'll just use my own language, a radical commitment to solidarity. I mean, that to me is the essence of what we are trying to do here together. So thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Adam Friedman.
Thank you so much, Reverend Adam Taylor. Thank you again to Joseph Tomas McKellar, to Udo, to Reverend Susie Hayward, Reverend Tracy Blackman, and in a moment we'll also have the great Reverend Jim Wallace close us out. But first, I just want to get really, really tangible for a moment. We have heard incredibly powerful testimony from folks leading this work on the front lines in their communities. And we know, as we've seen in the chat throughout this call, that this is something all of us are experiencing. And many of us are feeling scared, are looking to take the next step, but aren't sure exactly how to take that first step toward collective action, toward civil resistance. So I have some really tangible things I want to offer. But first, I just want to offer a quick anecdote from my tradition as a Jewish person, the story of Nachshon, who is part of a really important midrash where the Israelites, after fleeing Egypt, are standing in front of the Red Sea. And, in the Torah, we often hear the story of how Moses lifts his staff, plunges it down into the ground before the water and the sea parts. But in this midrash, in this story from the Jewish scholars that reflect, another story is lifted up, the story of Nachshon, who sees that the seas are not parting and walks into the water by himself without anyone else. And the water gets up to his thighs, nothing happens. The water gets up to his chest, nothing happens. And just as the water moves over his nose, the sea parts. And I lift up that midrash in this moment because, as our incredible panelists mentioned, This moment requires something extraordinary from all of us, knowing that, we're all just people, but because we do this shoulder to shoulder with one another, we can take that first step, trusting that these seas will part, trusting that our work, our faith, I might say, in one another will guide us through this moment. And so to go to some very tangible things that we can do right now, I know there was some amazing organizing in the chat. As an organizer, born and bred, I just was so excited to see it. Folks were saying, I'm from this place. I'm from this place. Let's connect. I saw emails and websites of local organizations and connections flying back and forth. I want to, in the last few minutes here, encourage folks to continue doing that and just name the big next step for us right now is moving from the learning we are doing, we will continue to do as you receive resources in the follow-up email, as you watch the 101 recording, but we also need to move to planning, right? And so doing that work, especially in person with folks in our community, is essential. And as I think you do and some folks in the chat mentioned, mobilize.us is a place where geographically you put in your zip code and you can see local actions being planned in your community. I encourage you to ask around, see what folks know about different events, find some friends who want to go try out some direct actions with you and show up. Just make some connections. Right? I encourage you, if you see the way that you can participate your highest and best use as engaging virtually, to continue attending educational sessions like this, but also join events that are more oriented on action, like phone banks and text banks focused on engaging other folks in your community to share information about tactics and different upcoming events with them. Now, one big thing I really want to lift up here before I pass it over to Reverend Wallace is a very, very exciting announcement. I'm grateful to share on behalf of Interfaith Alliance that tonight, right now, we are launching an organizing support fund where anyone on this call, anyone in your community, anyone across the United States is able to apply. And my colleague Zev Michelle, shout out Zev, is going to put this link in the chat. You can apply for between $1,000 and $3,000 to engage in civil resistance in your community. Again, nonviolent civil resistance, whether that's working with your community to provide food for protesters, to provide pastoral support, to organize a protest or direct action in your community, to host some sort of educational event, whatever that looks like based on the need of your community. This fund is designed to support your work. So please look at that link in the chat. Please apply. We know that there is so much need right now, and these funds are finite, but we hope that they will be taken up quickly. Amazing work will happen. And this fund is also part of our Choose Love, Not ICE campaign. And so everyone who receives an award from this fund will also receive Choose Love, Not ICE placards to put in your houses of worship, palm cards with action steps to share with your community members. I want you to know, to just end on this thought, that the path before us is challenging. It's okay to feel afraid. I know I often feel scared. And by being here tonight, by choosing to lean into not only education, but community and our own spiritual resiliency that come from our faith and from the legacy of those who have done this work before us, we are choosing courage, we are choosing bravery, we are choosing to take action in this moment, which we know because of our faith, our belief that something better is possible, ensures that something better is inevitable. And so with that, I will pass it over to Reverend Jim Wallace to offer us some closing words.
Closing blessing. Closing blessing. This whole evening has been a blessing to all of us, and we are so grateful to all of you who've been a part of it. We've talked about things that are new, but these things are also very old. There are unprecedented things occurring, but we've also been here before. What I heard tonight was an effort to do, a mission to do public discipleship, to take our faith public and do public discipleship. The media narrative that we're all hearing and seeing, the political narrative is about this being a test of democracy. And it is certainly a test of democracy. It's also a test of faith. It's also a test of faith. And that's what I heard tonight. So, so every authoritarian imperial ruler government, they always recruit religious supporters to support them. There's always a faith factor in what they're trying to do. In fact, the biblical prophets often referred to these false prophets as the prophets of the court, prophets of the court of the king, telling the king what the king wanted to hear. But for us, I think the question is, what will the faith factor be now with us? With all that you've heard, with all that we are, what will our faith factor be right now? All of us are surrounded by noise, political noise. Some of us, part of our job is to listen to the noise and try to interpret it, reflect upon it. When I hear all the noise, sometimes I get overwhelmed by it, by the noise, just too much noise. And I go to that wonderful scripture, first chapter, first book of the Bible, Genesis 1:26. And I imagine the noise all around me. And then the text says, then God said, almost be quiet. Then God said, and what does God say? Let us create humankind, all of us, in our own image and after our own likeness. The image of God movement, that's what we're about now. The Imago Dei movement, what's happening in Minneapolis and LA and Chicago and Portland, so many places. This is an Imago Dei movement. To go back to the core. Everything being done that we've talked about tonight is nothing less than an assault on the image of God and our neighbors, our loved ones, in all our faith traditions. So I would say, don't be afraid to show up as who you are. We are those who welcome every faith tradition and people with no faith tradition at all, as been said so well tonight. But let's show up as who we are, with stoles and collars and robes and Bibles and that show who we are, and welcome those who are also with us, and whether they're people of faith or not. But peace lovers won't be enough. We all love peace, but peace lovers won't be enough. And peacekeepers can just accommodate the world as it is. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. So we are entering into conflict to do conflict resolution. So I would offer this prayer. Lord, hover over us. Hover over us. Hover around us. Hover between us. Hover with us on the streets. Hover with us in our quiet, lonely places. Hover over us. I pray this attack on democracy could cause the revival, the refounding of genuine democracy for the first time in this country. I pray that all the distortions of religion might lead to a clarification of faith. I pray that we would all understand that we cannot love God without loving our neighbor as ourselves. Who is my neighbor? Is in the Good Samaritan parable. Who is my neighbor is the question we are asking and answering, as was said, by doing all kinds of things that we don't know what to do or how it will work, but we do it because we're trying to love our neighbor. I'll close with this text from the book of Hebrews. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I think we as people of faith are called to something deeper than optimism, which is often shallow, a mood, a feeling, a personality type. Now, hope is deeper than optimism. Hope is a decision. Hope is a choice we make because of this thing that we call faith. And I think hope means believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. We see evidence all around us that makes us not want to believe. But we're going to believe in spite of the evidence and watch the evidence change. Hope may be our best contribution to movements as communities of faith. So let us act and live and believe in hope. And I'm just so grateful for each of you on this call. And together, we will find a way to love our neighbors as ourselves. Amen.